Welcome to War of the Words. I'm your host, Wayne Besen. On today's show, we discuss the renegade Supreme Court. We pose the question, are they working for America or a radical movement to end democracy? Then we interview Sean Faircloth, former mayor of Bangor, Maine, and author of Attack of the Theocrats, how the religious right harms us all and what we can do about it. In our interview, we discuss the Supreme Court's brazen attack on separation of church and state. We end the show with a shocking story of Texas schools proposing to soft pedal slavery. They're calling it involuntary relocation. No, I'm not making that up. It's insane. I never in my life thought I'd have to ask this unnerving question. Is the Supreme Court working on behalf of the United States, or is it trying to forge a radical new nation from scratch? One that doesn't remotely resemble America. It's not that I merely disagree with their drastic and delusional decisions, although I vehemently do. It's a deceitful way these extremists blatantly lie to ascend to the high court, aided by the bad faith machinations of Senator Mitch McConnell. It's the way they flagrantly disregard public opinion and discount precedent as if previous rulings were scribbled on toilet paper. What we are experiencing in real time is an illegitimate cabal of religious renegades abusing power to force Americans to bow to their church-inspired views. It's nothing short of an insurgency of overreaching black-robed revolutionaries. By the time they are through perverting the Constitution, thwarting the will of the majority, and rewriting America's rulebook, the country as we know it will essentially cease to exist. Most notably, these rogues have feverishly labored to abolish separation of church and state, while disingenuously hiding behind the ludicrous, artificial philosophy of originalism. They gleefully trample our forefathers' vision of a nation that kept religion out of government. In doing so, they have cunningly flipped the U.S. Constitution on its axis, making enforcement of the First Amendment unconstitutional. How about that? Michael Dorf, a Cornell law professor, said the court's right-wing majority has radically redefined the role of religion and state. He said, quote, "They regard secularism, which for centuries has been the liberal world's understanding of what it means to be neutral, as itself a form of discrimination against religion." Yeah, that's the Supreme Court's nifty trick. It portrays those who follow the Constitution's Establishment Clause as guilty of discrimination. However, faith is fundamentally different. It's an act of discernment rather than discrimination to ensure that something as combustible as religion isn't government-sponsored. For centuries, up until the present day, wars have been fought over religion. The 30 Years' War, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the slaughter of indigenous people by Christian missionaries were all based on fanatics trying to impose their beliefs. The Islamists who crashed planes into the World Trade Center and Pentagon were guided by twisted, yet sincere, religious beliefs. The monstrous reign of the Taliban in Afghanistan and the barbarism of ISIS are prime examples of religious zealotry. The war in Ukraine is partially the result of Vladimir Putin's delusional religious vision that he is spreading the traditional values of the Holy Rus. In America, the groups largely behind the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol were guided by a skewed version of right-wing Christianity. That's a fact. Given the horrific, bloody track record of intertwining church and state, our nation's founders took great pains to create a secular nation. America was clearly founded as an experiment of government by regular men, not holy men. The founders did not want a state religion, nor did they include religious tests for public office. That's a fact. Nonetheless, this heedless, reckless, agenda-driven, broad daylight conspiracy of activist judges has brushed aside America's forefathers to merge government and God. It cannot be overstated what a fundamental departure the rulings are from historic jurisprudence. These unabashed, revolutionary ideologues are unmooring America from its foundations and justifying their perfidious actions with embarrassingly flimsy legal fig leaves. In a furious, obscene dash to solidify their dangerous, exclusionary worldview, the Supreme Court has dropped a blitzkrieg of legal bombs. In merely 8 weeks, they have bum-rushed 6 unpopular landmark decisions that have rendered America nearly unrecognizable. The most notable ruling was reversing Roe v. Wade, turning America's women into baby incubators with no control over their own bodies. Not specifically an attack on the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, only the most naive person wouldn't recognize that central to this heinous decision was the justice's desire to impose the personal right-wing Christian religious beliefs on all Americans. The coup court also sided with Joseph Kennedy, a proselytizing public school football coach in Washington state, who led flamboyant Christian prayers with players at the 50-yard line. As someone who personally experienced coercive Christianity while participating in sports and public school, I know firsthand that this abominable decision will lead to zealous coaches and teachers to reward students who pray while penalizing those who don't. These stealth missionaries on the High Court went on to endorse religious schools in Maine being funded by taxpayers. Yeah, you and me. So millions of fair-minded Americans now must subsidize their own discrimination. They are forced to funnel cash to born-again Christian institutions that brainwash children to believe in the subjugation of women, racial prejudice, and loathing LGBTQ people. Additionally, the court ruled in favor of a Christian group that sought to fly a flag with a cross at Boston City Hall, but was rebuffed because they violated separation of church and state. It's almost a foregone conclusion that this hopelessly biased, divisive Supreme Court majority will always elevate the faithful over competing concerns. Furthermore, the court ruled to permit the carrying of concealed handguns in New York City. While not ostensibly the promotion of religion, it is broadly in line with fundamentalist Christian support for interpreting the Second Amendment to allow universal access to weapons of war. Why would the followers of the Prince of Peace, Jesus, support such lunacy? Well, contemporary right-wing Christians are inundated by parachurch organizations, such as the Family Research Council, who portray them as victims. These unsavory groups peddle paranoia and depict evangelicals as martyrs under constant attack who must defend themselves against heretics and heathens. Finally, the court gutted environmental protections at a time when climate change is the greatest threat to mankind. The New York Times reports, quote, "One by one, the tools available to President Biden to fight climate change are being stripped away." After a Supreme Court decision on Thursday, the Environmental Protection Agency will have less authority to limit carbon dioxide from power plants, a major source in this country of pollution that is dangerously heating the planet. The United States, the world's largest historic emitter of greenhouse gases, pledged to cut its pollution in half by the end of the decade. Some experts say that after the Supreme Court's decision in the case West Virginia versus EPA, it will soon be mathematically impossible to meet that goal. This, once again, is a faith-based ruling by a religious extremist who are putting our nation and planet in jeopardy. Other than industrialists that stand to profit, the primary group of people who oppose fighting climate change are religious nuts. They fervently believe that God gave man dominion over earth, and thus we can abuse the planet and the Lord will solve the problem. Meanwhile, most rational people who rely on data, facts, and science are helplessly trapped in a matrix of their madness. If the coup court does nothing else, doesn't lift another finger, it has already significantly damaged our country. Unfortunately, all indications show they are just warming up. They announced on Thursday that they are taking a new case, Moore versus Harper, that could literally spell the end of democracy. In carefully selecting this case, they seem intent on ruling that state legislatures have the exclusive authority to set and interpret state election laws. This would potentially give radicalized GOP majority legislatures the unchecked ability to overturn elections. That's right, thwart the will of the people. And under such a ridiculous interpretation of the law, governors, state courts, and even voters could do nothing to remedy brazen election theft. Vox, who wrote about this, called the crazy case perhaps the gravest threat to American democracy since the January 6th attack. If this weren't scary enough, the coup court appears to be working with extremist lawmakers to enact their Gilead-like vision. In response to Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion that the court should review rulings that permit marriage equality, contraception, and LGBTQ people engaging in sexual relations, Texas Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton signaled that he would happily defend the state's archaic sodomy law if the Supreme Court elects to revisit the issue. Terrifying. Given the extremism of today's GOP and the advances in surveillance technology since the 2003 sodomy ruling, Lawrence versus Texas, what Paxton suggests is an act of war against the LGBTQ community. The enforcement of new sodomy laws would likely lead to a totalitarian regime of secret police reminiscent of the Stasi. That innocuous gay app you're using to get a date? That could soon be evidence of sodomy, which would lead to police kicking down your door in the middle of the night. With a fascist bent to the Republican Party, it's not difficult to imagine right-wing prosecutors trying to make a name for themselves by creating a dragnet to arrest LGBTQ people. If one objectively steps back to consider the totality of the Supreme Court majority's swift and sweeping actions, it's fair to ask whether they are serving America or a subversive movement to overthrow the United States. We already know that Clarence Thomas is on board with shredding the Constitution, given the treasonous actions of his big lie-promoting wife, Ginny. If 4 additional justices share in Thomas's perverse vision for our country, as it increasingly appears they do, our nation could rapidly disintegrate or be disfigured into an authoritarian theocracy that resembles a Christian version of Iran. We can no longer say, it couldn't happen here. It could never happen here. It's America. Each day provides fresh evidence that a terrifying transformation is already underway. An unhinged Supreme Court majority isn't even bothering to slowly boil the American frog into submission. It's gleefully pitching the frog in the light of day into a bubbling cauldron of water as an arrogant show of unchecked force. These are not impartial actions of reasonable judges who aim to represent all Americans, but the ambitious actions of mutinous rebels who are intent on toppling democracy. Now joining us is Sean Faircloth, the former mayor of Bangor, Maine, a former state senator and author of Attack of the Theocrats, How the Religious Right Harms Us All and What We Can Do About It. He's also the former executive director for the Secular Coalition for America. But most important, Faircloth ran for U.S. Senate in 1994 and I was his press secretary. I can tell you from personal experience that Faircloth represents everything good about public service. He's an inspiration and a friend. Sean, welcome to the show.
Hey, Wayne. Good to see you.
Church and state has been attacked at an unprecedented level by the Supreme Court in recent weeks. As someone who has spent his life fighting against theocracy, this must be incredibly disturbing to you as it is to me.
Yeah, I mean, they have really, for lack of a better term, come out of the closet in this session and really laid out. And I know it sounds harsh, but I think there's a reality to it. There's kind of a Christo-fascist angle to where this is all headed. I mean, when you look at the Bremerton case with the football coach in Washington State, as Sotomayor and others, Justice Sotomayor and others have pointed out, basically it is becoming that the so-called free exercise clause in the First Amendment is swallowing and taking over, erasing the establishment clause, which prohibits establishment of religion. I mean, they had evidence directly in front of them of sort of the obvious, but that the boys who were on this football team, they felt pressure, as one would with a coach, who was kneeling and praying in a public display in front of everyone, including at the homecoming game.
It was ostentatious. I mean, it was in your face. He was trying to proselytize.
As a government employee in actually at one of the most highly visible positions of a public school employee. And he wasn't kneeling and praying for Islam. He wasn't kneeling and praying for congregational Christians or Unitarian Universalists or Reformed Jews. It was obvious the type of Christianity that he is speaking for, and that one, therefore, as a young person, feels the pressure. And literally, they had students who came forward and described this, said they felt this pressure. That is exactly it.
And I know firsthand. I was on the football team, the only Jewish student in the entire school in suburban Houston. And I remember my coach was like, you might lose your position because you have to go to Hebrew school, and there were prayers. And when I also moved,
Really?
yes, yeah,
Wow.
I felt this firsthand. I know exactly what this is like. And you need to please your coach because for any reason, he can put you on the bench and you'll never, ever get on the field of the court. I also experienced this in Hawaii. They was, quote, student led prayer. And they always ended this in Jesus' name we pray. This was a public school. And of course, there were Buddhist and atheist and Jewish people. And of course, we had to go along with it, lest we be troublemakers. That was the time in the late 80s. And people were afraid to speak up or speak out because you didn't want to be a rebel rouser who was against religion because you could end up on the bench. So this is very real. And people do feel compelled to pray or stay silent.
And essentially, given this ruling, it is hard to envision if they won't stop establishment, advocacy, basically, of religion through government in this context. You've got young people basically in a vulnerable situation and a coach kneeling so ostentatiously for his fundamentalist viewpoint, then where would you prohibit establishment of religion? It really kind of takes it so that the rule has been swallowed by the free exercise clause in a way that's clearly not the intent of the founders. I mean, it's remarkable to me in a sense, when you look at this, they had their faults. Obviously, Madison and Jefferson were slave owners and had their faults, but really, in a sense, this ruling is to the right of two guys who were born in the 1730s and 1740s. I mean, that was the unique offering in some ways of the American Bill of Rights at that time. It was always true. Yes, the government was intertwined with religion, always was. And they were saying for the first time, in a rather, you have to acknowledge, revolutionary, and I would say very positive way, no, you keep the religion out of the government. And here this is, I'm saying, well, what is the power of this, in a sense, unique founding clause of the American Constitution? I mean, it's a devastating blow.
It really is. And I think the Supreme Court conservatives have everything backwards. They are saying that everything is a discrimination against religion. Well, no, the founders understood that there were wars over religion. We had the 30-year War, we had the Crusades, we had the Inquisition, and there was a difference. And you need to separate church and state because of the passions it arouses. That's why we don't, for example, want public money funneled to religious schools, because I, for one, don't want to be subsidizing what I consider in some cases very noxious points of view. But that's what we just saw, for example, in Maine with one of the Supreme Court's rulings. And that hits home for you as a former mayor of Bangor.
Here in my neighborhood, I've served as a state senator and mayor, a majority whip in my legislature here in Maine. And here in the Bangor region, yes, there was a Christian school who challenged this case where they were saying we could get taxpayer dollars, your taxpayer dollars, if you're a Maine resident. And obviously, again, this violates the very concept of separation of church and state. Now, luckily in Maine, we do have express statutes that prohibit LGBTQ discrimination, receipt of public funds, or discrimination against girls. As I've written before in my book, Attack of the Theocrats and elsewhere, it's very concerning when this money goes to public schools. Goes to private schools that are religiously affiliated. And I think a lot of people are ignorant of how far they can go to the right. Some of the curricula, the express curricula of these programs, talk about girls being subservient now, today, in the 2020s. And you just think, how can this be real at this at this day and time?
Alito went back to the 19th century when he quoted one of the rulings with 1868. That is where they're looking, not way before the 1950s here.
Right. And so this is a trend that I don't want to say commend, but you have to acknowledge that the far right has been working on this for decades. The Supreme Court is stacked. I don't think there's any other way of looking at it. I cited the other day the number of justices who supported the Roe versus Wade decision, either then when it was first ruled in 1973 or in like Casey and other subsequent cases. And it was like, I forget, it was about 8 or 9 Republican appointed justices who affirmed this decision. This idea that it's somehow abhorrent to recognize a right to privacy or that it's somehow not moderate. No, these were Republican appointed justices. But what they've done since Bork is really go forward with, we want right-wing ideologues. And I challenge any of your listeners to contradict these 2 points, that when they get on the bench, and I'm talking about the Sam Alitos of the world, these new right-wing ideologues that now have—
the cult member.
When you look at Supreme Court rulings from this far-right court, there's really only one legal principle, and it's not a legal principle, or 2 that they follow. One is if it's corporations versus anything else, the corporation wins.
Right.
The other one,
it's a foregone conclusion.
Is, and I think this is sort of a secondary priority originally, but now it's become dominant, is that the fundamentalist Christian right also wins. And they can dress it up however they want, but those 2 principles, you will not see them contradicted. That's what, and they have been successful in establishing this kind of power structure, which fundamentally undermines the operation of our democratic institutions in this country.
Yeah, I mean, they're looking at a theocracy. I think several members of this court do not like democracy. They want to have essentially a theocracy, and it's absolutely terrifying where they're going. But I would say they're arguably illegitimate. And here's something I'll never get over, that Mitch McConnell, he would not give a hearing to Merrick Garland. Millions of people voted for Barack Obama who didn't even want him to be president because they believed that he would be able to appoint members of the Supreme Court. And then McConnell took that away because he said, oh, it's right before an election. Then he turns around with Amy Coney Barrett, and right before the election, he spearheads her getting put on the court. That to me was an act of betrayal to democracy and a wound that I will never get over. And therefore, I cannot abide by anything this court says, because I think this was in such horrifically bad faith, that move, that it upset the balance of America. And it's something I don't know if we recover from. I mean, I think it was that severe of an attack on our country, what McConnell did.
It is. I don't think there's a way to sugarcoat it. We have reason to worry about our democracy. In March, I went and volunteered in Poland and Ukraine because I was inspired by, and this is a very lowly job, I was with an NGO where we, helped refugees.
You didn't have a howitzer?
No. And in fact,
it's just going to clarify.
The guy says, unless you've got the proper training, don't do that. But it was gratifying to be involved and supportive of it, and I was inspired by the democratic process. But something that really sinks home for me is that when you look at Freedom House and others that rate in an objective fashion democracy, Ukraine was moving forward and getting better, and they had their foothold for democracy in a way that was truly inspiring. America has been downgraded by objective measures of democracy, by international organizations that measure the strength of democracy. And this Supreme Court, even before you got the wild-eyed extremists that we have in the court now, if you look at the 2000 election, I think was a pivotal moment in American history in every analysis of the vote in Florida. If, as the Florida Supreme Court actually was heading toward, they were saying, well, we'll just count all the votes. We'll just see who won by counting all the votes in all the counties in Florida, and forget, Bush, forget Gore. We'll just count the votes and see what happened. The Supreme Court of the United States, I have to say, sadly, it was Sandra Day O'Connor as one of the votes, just said, no, we're going to stop the vote, freeze it in this clearly erroneous snapshot. And therefore, all subsequent analysis has shown it's, that's not the way it would turn out. Said, all right, we're giving Florida to Mr. Bush, also in the context of that Gore had won by a substantial margin in the popular vote. When you look at these Supreme Court justices and count up, I mean, when you have Bush appointees, when you have the Trump appointees, these are appointees who came from a presidents who did not win the support of the American people.
Well, Democrats who have won 7 of the last 9 elections with popular support. We got the most votes in 7 of 9 elections. And yet, because of the chicanery that we're looking at, we have a 6-3 margin of, I don't even think they're conservatives anymore, of I mean, fascists. I don't know, totalitarians. I don't know what you want to call them, and where they're headed right now.
Well, something I want to commend you for bringing up, because I think you said, it's time to fight back, is that in the progressive and the Democratic Party world, there's always been our tendency, in some ways it's noble, to say on the one hand, on the other hand. And I want to give you an example from back in my law school era when Judge Bork was nominated to the Supreme Court.
Robert Bork, not the singer Bjork. I just want to clarify.
Right.
not
the. I would probably prefer.
Oh, I would definitely vote for Bjork instead of Bork.
Yeah. So at that time, and in subsequent years, Ted Kennedy, to set the scene, Ted Kennedy went down and he gave this speech, and he gave it in this kind of stem-winding Ted Kennedy way about, here's the kind of America you'd get. Back alley abortions, I think, was one of the phrases from a Judge Bork coming to the court. And at the time, he was attacked and said, "Oh, you're being an extremist, Ted Kennedy. You're coming up with crazy, unfair characterizations." But actually, in fact, this speech that he gave was vetted by his staff, and it was basically just elucidating what Bork himself had said in his law journal articles and in court decisions about what would happen. The thing that has occurred since is that people like that became a majority, a super majority, on the Supreme Court. So actually, it turns out that what Ted Kennedy was only doing was saying, here's what he said, and if you get these kind of justices, here's what you get. Well, now we've got it.
We have a bunch of Bork clones. Yeah, that's the story of my career, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well. And I've said the same thing for years because I've been to their conferences. I've been undercover. I've been to these right-wing confabs over and over again over decades. And I come back and I report, this is what they're saying they want to do. This is their plan. This is how they're going about it. And people will say that is extreme. They're not going to do that. I'm saying, no, this isn't my opinion. They're telling us. And our side has a tendency to bury your head in the sand.
Or you're being impolite to bring it up. Well, but this is in fact evidentiary, and I think it's sort of a self-fulfilling, continual ratcheting to the right. I think if you look, to take an example of where America was sociologically, like if you go back to the early 1960s, lots of terrible things happening. I mean, discrimination against African Americans and flagrant in the law. Women's rights was barely even an idea. LGBTQ was just, far outside the horizon. So horrible, bad things were happening. But I will say there was a directional approach and a form of civic discourse that was different. For example, when the Supreme Court ruled and said, no prayer in schools because of some of the reasons we've just described, because it, is coercive to those who might have a minority viewpoint. You might be non-religious, you might be Buddhist, whatever the case may be. The press asked President Kennedy about it, and he was like, well, you can pray at home. You can pray over the weekend. And he kind of shrugged it off. And it was not much news. I mean, there was the fundamentalist circle that did not like it, but they were far less of a force in American society at that point. It was far less debated. And also, you did not have the Fox News ultra-right echo chamber as the most popular, broadcast media, which fundamentally changes.
It changes it because of the bubble. People don't hear the truth. There was actually one study where people who watched Fox knew less about the news than people who watched no news.
Right. Well, Justice Powell, who, if you met him, would be a courtly, gentlemanly person. He's not, in the Clarence Thomas fire-breathing style. But he wrote a memo about how if you really want to succeed, and this is before he ascended to the court when Nixon appointed him, he said, what you, and he meant you, the kind of corporate clients he had as a big corporate attorney, was you need to establish a movement. You've got all these people speaking out for civil rights and so forth over the course of the 1960s. Says you need to establish, using your monetary money, establish a counter movement. It's called the Powell Memo. And he describes
the infamous Powell Memo. Yes, the beginning of the end of the middle class.
Banks and all of this stuff, so that you create this counter narrative. Forget whether the facts are accurate, forget whether it's judiciously neutral, but just create the counter story with the Federalist Society and so forth, and all these intellectual sounding organizations in the DC Beltline, and then the fire-breathing Fox News on the outside. And you've got a formula for success that I have to acknowledge, they've been tremendously successful.
Well, they're more organized.
But an irony is, I feel like the Powell group, the sort of corporate lawyer world, they wanted to create this world. I don't think they would have pictured Donald Trump, but their monster kind of got out of control.
I mean, isn't that the story of the world, really, where you people empower extremists? We saw the same thing with Afghanistan. We wanted to beat the Soviets, so we put money into what later became Al Qaeda. When Egypt happened, I mean, Saudi Arabia, that happened around 79, 80, when they empowered the extremists there. Every single place I can think of where they said, let's empower extremists to further agenda. We can handle them. We can control them. And once the genie is let out of the bottle, it takes over. I think that's one of the great lessons that need to be learned from this century and the previous century.
Yeah, I'm worried. I want to be optimistic. I'm an optimistic person by nature. I served 10 years in my legislature and 3, including here as mayor of the city. And I work for things and will continue to work for progress on civil rights and on climate change. But I worry that the functioning of our society may just not be up to the tasks ahead. I mean, this isn't the topic of this podcast, but when I look at climate change coming at us like a freight train, you need some kind of major leadership. And given the nature of, say, by-elections, where it tends to be the president in power loses votes in the Congress, it's looking uphill to try to achieve these things.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about climate change because that's one of your issues in a few minutes. But I wanted to talk about, I worked on your Senate race for U.S. Senate, I think it was 94, 95. And you told the people of Maine, you said, Joe Brennan, former governor, good guy, but he's lost twice and he's not going to beat Susan Collins. And oh my God, were you right? And I was young. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I mean, it was just like, yay, opportunity. I have a job. And with this great candidate who I believe in, but
thank you.
Oh my God, I never understood at the time, and probably you didn't either, how consequential that election actually was. Instead of Sean Faircloth in the Senate for 20 years leading, we got Susan Collins, the ultimate Trump bootlicking phony who's always concerned about everything and troubled, but always goes and votes the wrong way. Talk about the consequence for Maine and the country of Susan Collins. And now she says she got duped by, she got duped over the 2 Supreme Court nominees, Gorsuch and the beer drinker. I'm blanking.
Kavanaugh.
Brett Kavanaugh. Yes, I blanked out. Yeah.
To acknowledge, the effectiveness of it is the little, I'm concerned, and let's all discuss this.
I'm troubled.
If you look at Susan Collins's record, I actually wrote a piece here in the state describing Alito's record. I simply reported his record while he was a nominee and said, this guy is a far-right extremist ideologue.
And he is.
Susan Collins, of course, dances around and ultimately votes for him, and then others who are even more flagrant since. And it's long as you, in the context of this state, which is more purple than red, sort of throw a rhetorical bone to the other side, people will buy it. And who else will buy it hook, line, and sinker, sadly, so often, is small state media. Like they will just go, oh, well, they said on the one hand, on the other hand, so that means they're moderate. And rather than, well, look at where the results are for all of their alleged moderation, because the policies that she's ultimately supported and seen to fruition are far right policies, and the media just doesn't dig. Another worry I have for democracy is when I first served in the Maine legislature, for example, there's so much action in state politics and state elections, but the number of reporters, because of the online world of what paid reporters, professional reporters, is dramatically down. You're just employed, working, digging out the stories. And so it's a lot easier for politicians, especially smaller states, to get away with stuff.
Yeah, because without the investigative reporters, you're not going to get the digging. And investigating reporting, because I've done it, is expensive and it takes time. So when you don't have those types of reporters, you get the shallow he said, she said. One side agrees and the other disagrees, as if the false equivalencies that have been so devastating and elevated those who lie.
And even on the national level, you see that the false equivalency, where they'll say, for example, one that I see repeatedly is where they'll say, well, Fox and MSNBC, if those are the same. Now, certainly Rachel Maddow is a progressive and would happily say so, but she's not night after night engaging in wacko lying. She's just not. And to have that type of commentator compared to what's happening at False News, where they're directly dishing out directly false statements over and over to millions upon millions of people, it's just not a valid comparison. But you'll see that made even by national commentators, obviously. And so people just throw up their hands. If you look back to the type of commentary like after Roe versus Wade, I think it was the third story on the news, Huntley, Brinkley, and Cronkite, and obviously it was controversial, but it was not at the level of fire-breathing wackoness that we see now.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because there were many Baptist churches, for example, that supported Roe v. Wade. It was not controversial. It became controversial because the religious right, which started out because they were angry that their segregation academies had to either lose their tax exempt status or allow Black kids in school.
Right. Bob Jones University.
Yeah. As society became less racist, they could no longer be openly racist about this and saying, we want segregation. So then they had to find new issues with code words, and abortion and homosexuality were the two that they picked. And they made this through direct mail campaigns. And then, of course, with C-SPAN after that, with Gingrich and so forth, they made abortion into this huge issue. But it wasn't at the beginning. This is a manufactured issue from the right, not something that they were always for. And they don't even know this, most of their voters.
I think it's sort of again, the monster getting out of control, because I think there was this strategy, the Powell memo of increasing corporate power, big money interests get what they want. And that was a concerted and planned effort, as with the Koch brothers, that kind of idea. But then they said, we'll throw red meat to the folks who will vote with us in November. And that sort of ended up swallowing the concept, but still the corporate folks win also. But I think they didn't picture how rabid and insane it would be.
Yeah, well, they win until they don't. And we saw that in Russia, that these oligarchs got behind Putin at the beginning, and then he swallowed them up and owned them. And we would see the same thing. And we're already seeing it, the way, for example, Ron DeSantis in Florida went after Disney because they opposed this Don't Say Gay law. We saw DeSantis even went after Special Olympics. And so nobody's safe. And these corporations are going to find that they will have to be subservient. And that is exactly what they had never expected. You also have been big in children's issues. And now with Roe v. Wade being overturned and the Dobbs decision, what is the impact going to be across the country, particularly with children?
Well, my concern about education is that if you look at where this court is headed, appears, and like the Maine decision, that they will go further if given the opportunity to talk about funding for religious schools in this country and for absolute protection, at least of right-wing religious views for teachers in direct state-funded schools. So you just look at what kind of America they will not only envision, but enact. And I always find it ironic because they always accuse progressives of legislating from the bench. Well, this set of decisions, in fact, there's one as we were sitting here that just came down on environmental protection, and I haven't had a chance to read the decision. But of course, the three.
I'm guessing they're not establishing new national parks. That's probably not part of it.
It's sort of taking away the ability of the government.
The EPA, yeah.
Yeah, and so I view this as they have extra votes on the Supreme Court to effectively legislate from the bench, like with the gun cases. I mean, come on. They claim that they're originalists, which was a made-up concept from the 1970s. Nobody, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, nobody used that phrase or that's a new recent.
And of course, we all want to act, we all want to refer to a time forever when people owned slaves and women couldn't vote and LGBTQ people essentially didn't exist. We should be stuck there forever.
Right. And also what's entertaining about it is even by their own lights, even by their own alleged originalist logic in the gun decision, he cherry picks the history. There were lots of regulations, both at the time of the founding by states and localities or colonies in that case, and then in the 1860s when they say that we could look at that era as well. But even in that time, there were states with gun regulations and lots of them, but he cherry picks his way through it, Justice Thomas does, in that majority decision. So even by their alleged originalist conception, they're not following their own rules. So that's what I mean by legislating from the bench.
Right. And they used to complain about that. They used to accuse of liberals of that. And they are masters of legislating from the bench.
I'd say they are mostly the case. I mean, even if you go back to the 50s and 60s, I take the viewpoint of, say, the Warren Court, Justice Brennan, admire the decisions that they had. But the conservatives on those courts were not way out in the wacko right field that we're seeing now. This is new. This is different. And it's a kind of activism where they're not even trying. Like, I'm not saying I'm the greatest legal scholar ever on earth, but it's like you read these majority opinions and you say, come on, you're not even attempting to come up with a
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems like the ghostwriter is Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham. I mean, that's what they read like. Only a couple more questions. What's your opinion so far of the January 6th hearings? What's your take from it?
Well, I think they have shown some effectiveness. I'm impressed by the job they've done by getting some attention, which is so hard in the sort of multi-voice cacophonous world that we have, but at least I think it's getting some people's attention. Will it be enough? I don't know. I mean, I spent my life studying the Watergate hearings where, there were only 3 networks then, 4 if you counted public television, and, the kind of American populace was sort of as one. It's kind of like, could the Beatles exist today, even whatever their talents, the sort of unified media world doesn't exist in the same way. So I don't know if it will have the same oomph. I have to hold out hope that when we come to the next presidential election, that it's not Trump or DeSantis that take it over, because if it does come to that point where you have someone of that ilk take the presidency again, then I really do fear for the existence of the American Republic and whether it will withstand. And I got to say, he wasn't my first choice. I'm rooting for Biden, but it's a tough hand. I mean, just as sympathetic as I want to be with Biden, I think, geez, my mom, who's 80, going to be 84, it's just being president's a very tough job, and it's going to be difficult. To think of someone who's going to be 87, 88, and I want him to, if he's the guy, I'm all for him. I'm all for anyone. But I feel like the cards are looking very difficult if he insists on running, and then who's the alternative if he doesn't? So we have a hard hand to play, a difficult hand to play, those of us who care about civil liberties, those of us who care about basics of democracy. And I just encourage people to go out and help with your local electeds and statewide electeds who hold the Constitution dearly, because we may lose it.
We very well might. And I never thought I'd say that or think that, but we are on the precipice. We're on the brink. This is a make or break couple of elections. But what scares me, and I wanted to ask you about this, the Republicans, if you look at all the election deniers that they've put in place, many of these trumpets won their primaries. And not just for major positions, but those who control elections, Secretary of States, and even people on election boards. And we could be in a position where a Democrat wins and the Republicans will not allow that to happen in swing states. And that is what I fear the most. And I saw a glimpse of this. I lived in Philadelphia for the last election. I was across the street. I saw it from my window, the convention center where the votes were counted. Every day we had Proud Boys and Patriot Front and all the dregs of society out there trying to steal the election. We had somebody arrested a block from me with weapons. That was right next to where I lived. And I saw a glimpse of this nastiness and this conflict. I was part of it. I went out and encountered them. I felt it, and it was scary. And I'm afraid that if the Republicans try to pull what they did on January 6th within 50 states and try to overthrow the election, God help this country. I don't know how that ends.
Right. You've got street bullies, right, with guns in some cases that are going to be out there at the polls. I don't think there's any way that that's not going to happen in multiple locations. And then all they need is a few, right? I mean, so they're running these QAnon-ish, Trump-ish candidates for the positions that count the votes in counties and at the statewide level. And they don't need a lot. Say it's a close-ish race, and one or two states that are pivotal states. They don't need to have all of them. Just if they have a couple states that are pivotal states, combined with the intimidation, which is, I think, what you're going to see at the polls, it's volatile. So I honestly hope that if the Democrats can rebound so that they win solidly, because I think if it's a close one, we're going to look at people with guns who do not care about democracy in places where in election where the situation is chaotic or can be even perceived as fuzzy. Then you've got a real dangerous time on your hands.
They don't want democracy. And I remember going to these right-wing conferences, and I found there was a big change when Obama was elected. They realized that the majority of Americans no longer supported the theocratic positions. And then they turned on democracy. If we can't win with the vote, we can win without a vote, meaning overturning democracy. And that is what we are seeing right now, this authoritarian bent, and it's terrifying.
I think they already did that once in a more decorous and savvy way in 2000. But I think, they're showing the gloves are coming off. And so what do we do? And I think we have to stand up. I had a friend say, well, you should just give up. It's all throw in the towel. And I say, no, like what you said, I saw in that recent media interview, is we got to fight back. We got to stand up tall, and we got to say those of us who do care about democracy are not kidding either. And we're going to be out there on the street fighting mad and ready. I don't mean violent, but be ready and be strong, because this is touch and go.
Yeah. And what I really fear is if America loses and becomes a theocracy, I'm looking around the world. We have Russia on one pole over here, which is authoritarian. We've got China on the other, which is totalitarian at this point. And Europe, if we're not there, is going to be squeezed by these forces. And you've got, for example, in France, we just saw the elections with Le Pen, and the national rally, the national pep rally for Russia, as I call them, has taken a lot of power. And who leads the world for freedom at that point? All the powers at that point will be authoritarian. Then what?
As we sort of tap dance our way off with climate change, where it doesn't matter what our politics are, climate change doesn't wait for us. So it's a pivotal time, and I'm hoping that we shall overcome.
I'm not worried about that, because the Christian right tells me that Jesus is going to solve it, and then we'll all be okay. So we don't have to worry about climate change. Okay, final question. What message should the Democrats bring into the elections to stave off the impending disaster for democracy?
Well, I do think Democrats need to be pragmatic. And one message that I think Democrats have neglected, and I think this is in part due to the partial, hate to say it, partial purchase of the Democratic Party by big money interests, because the Democratic Party doesn't have the fire-breathing, bug-eyed wackos in any large degree. But I do think that Democrats have neglected the average Joe or Jane who says, what about the money in my pocket? It's ironic, but when you had Franklin Roosevelt, a privileged straight white guy, ultra wealthy family, same with Kennedy, but in those times, people trusted them that they were for the working guy and gal. They were going to help them get more money in their pocket. And frankly, I think that the Democrats have largely lost that impetus when Trump, I hate to say it, but when Trump started talking about trade, I don't necessarily agree with, these are those specifics, but I think he appealed to the guy who works at a gas station in Ohio and said, he gave them the impression, he obviously didn't really care, but he gave them the impression of potentially he cared about them. So I would argue the Democratic Party should speak out for the working class economic issues. Let's put more money in your pocket. Let's talk about fair taxation, just fair taxation, so you get more money in your pocket. And I feel like Democrats have been too tepid about that. We've been strong and should be about civil rights and civil liberties. But I think if we were to speak out more strongly in the pocketbook issues, it would really help. And it's something they've neglected at the upper echelons of the party.
Yeah, I agree with you. You have to have a broad appeal to win elections and have a large agenda that has a vision of how to improve people's lives. And I think the Democrats really need to get back to that in order to stop the tsunami of madness that is coming our way if we don't stop it. Sean, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today on War of the Words. I enjoyed our conversation. It was great having you.
Anyway, well, hey, it's great talking to you.
One of the most overquoted poems is First They Came by theologian Martin Niemöller, but it's apropos for what's occurring today in America. Niemöller said, quote, "First they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Today's radicalized Republican Party is coming for you. They're coming for you. First, they smeared Antifa as a terrorist organization. People forget that Antifa stands for anti-fascist, so of course the fascist Republican Party wanted them eliminated. Then the GOP slimed Black Lives Matter. They consistently lied about peaceful BLM protests, falsely portraying these demonstrations for racial justice as violent. Very few had any violence, and I know because I attended several BLM protests in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. Then the Republicans went after critical race theory, which taught the truth about American history. The system was largely set up to keep Black people from succeeding. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. Whether it was Jim Crow, redlining to segregate neighborhoods, or locking Black people out of certain professions, discrimination in this country was ubiquitous and very real. Who can deny that? But Republicans don't want to teach real history, so they banned critical race theory. They slimed it. They smeared it. Instead of education, our children now get indoctrination. Then the Republicans trained their fundamentalist fire on gay and lesbian people by falsely accusing them of being groomers. Sounds ominous, doesn't it? Even though most molestations are occurring in right-wing churches like the Southern Baptist Convention and the Catholic Church, they have the nerve to accuse LGBT people of being a threat to children. The Texas government is threatening to kidnap transgender children from their parents if their parents follow medical advice to help their child transition. Libraries across the nation are being purged of books with LGBTQ content. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis spearheaded the Don't Say Gay law. The impact has already been felt. Gay high school students have been prohibited from mentioning their sexual orientation in graduation speeches. Gay teachers in Orange County, Florida, where I was born, have been told to hide their families by not placing family pictures on their desks. Think about it. I warned that this was a dangerous, slippery slope. Tragically, I've been proven correct. We learned today that public schools in Texas, under new social studies standards proposed to the state's education board, would describe slavery to second graders as involuntary relocation. Yeah, you heard that right. Slavery will be described as involuntary relocation. It's 2022, and apparently slavery is controversial again. It's a topic for debate with two sides. It reminds me of my childhood in suburban Texas, where the Civil War was often referred to as the War of Northern Aggression. The Confederate traitors were lauded for their bravery and commitment to their lost cause. It seems that Republicans want to indoctrinate children with propaganda, peddling right-wing fantasy and fiction instead of truth. Children will be force-fed tall tales of pseudo-history because Republican snowflakes can't handle what really happened in society. They're afraid it will make them look bad. Well, maybe they should look bad. That's their history. See how this works, folks? See how this works? The fascist Republican Party has divided us, and in doing so, they may conquer. They outlawed abortion, and many people did nothing because they won't need an abortion. Who cares about anybody else? It's all about me, me, me. All about me. Then they moved on. And they burned books with gay content and trashed the First Amendment by passing laws where you can't say gay. Yeah, in America, they're banning words, they're banning phrases. Amazing. And many people did nothing because they aren't gay, and they didn't believe they were impacted. Again, it's all about me, me, me. It doesn't affect me. And now we have devolved to the point where we can't say slavery. We need euphemisms such as involuntary relocation. And many people won't do a damn thing, as they didn't when critical race theory was banned, because they aren't African American. Again, me, me, me. I guarantee you that the next step down this perilous path is Holocaust denial. As sure as the sun rises and sets, anti-Semitic, white supremacist lawmakers somewhere in America are going to create Don't Say Holocaust bills. They are going to portray the Holocaust as controversial instead of settled fact. There is no rock bottom with the fascist fringe that is now coming out of the woodwork to impose its wicked will on the American people. The bottom for these folks is the hellish molten center of the earth. That's how deep they will sink this country with their primitive bigotry and barbarism. There is a lesson to be learned here. We will sink or swim together. If the right wing divides us, they will devour us, one group at a time. If we stand up for each other, join hands, and fight together, we can save America from this growing cancer that is rapidly spreading from coast to coast. Join me. Together, we can do this. We don't have to be captives to the crazies. We can bring America to a place that's rational and reasonable, that treats all people equally with dignity and respect. Thank you for joining me, your host Wayne Besen, for War of the Words today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please tell your friends about us. We're available on every major platform such as Apple, Spotify, and Anchor. Until we meet again, see you next time.